The humble flashcard, a key component in a successful strategy, or a distraction from what truly matters. Few things have sparked as much debate as the use of flashcards for learning a foreign language. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about flashcards. Not only this week actually, I'm going to follow this episode up with at least 2 other episodes looking at different aspects of flashcards, and in this first one we will focus on the upsides, on the benefits of using flashcards for learning Chinese. I remember clearly what it was like to start using flashcards for learning vocabulary in Chinese, and not just in Chinese but in any other language, because up to that point I had not used this method, and many benefits became obvious very quickly. I was suddenly able to remember almost all the vocabulary I encountered and decided to learn, and it also allowed me to nail every single test I took, including bigger exams, which of course was quite useful in the courses I were in. Flashcards allowed me to achieve this while spending less time on vocabulary than I would otherwise have done. And this is particularly true for handwriting Chinese characters, which is an area where flashcards really shine. Using flashcards also had some mental or psychological benefits in that I felt more in control of my vocabulary learning, and I was always a little bit anxious back then that I would forget the words that I learned, but now that I had the flashcards I was able to recall most of the words that I wanted to recall, and that felt great. Many students do complain about hearing and seeing lots of words, but then being unable to recall them later. When I first started using flashcards, it felt a little bit like magic, but of course flashcards aren't magic, but are instead underpinned by several important principles that make them very efficient for learning certain types of information. These principles are the spacing effect and active recall, and I've mentioned both of these on the podcast many times, so I will keep this description fairly brief. The spacing effect has been thoroughly researched, and it shows that reviews spread out over time are more efficient than the same number of reviews clumped together. A simple example would be if you wanted to learn how to write a Chinese character by hand and then remember it later. So you could either write this character 50 times in a row right now, which will give you a certain chance of being able to remember it at a future date. You could also spread these reviews out over time, maybe once per day or maybe twice per day, once in the morning, once in the evening. But there is space between the reviews. And the research then shows that this latter form, the spaced repetition, is much more efficient than the clumped together version, the massed repetition. Software built on this principle is usually called spaced repetition software, and you probably know some examples such as Pleco, Skritter or Anki. The second principle that can explain why flashcards are so powerful for learning, say, the basic meaning of words, is something called active recall. And this is when you actively have to search your memory for the information you're looking for or you're trying to remember. So, for example, you could ask yourself, what is the word for memory in Chinese, or how do you write this word? And if you're then able to say 记忆 or be able to write the characters for that word, then you have successfully retrieved that information from memory. And this is then active recall because you didn't see the answer, you had to retrieve it from memory actively. Compare this with just seeing the word directly. So for example, looking at the characters for 记忆 and then using that as a review for how to write them. And as anyone who has tried learning to write Chinese knows, simply looking at characters is a horrible way of learning how to write them by hand. But this also extends to other types of information, not just handwritten characters. So the spacing effect and active recall can explain why flashcards work in general and why it sometimes feels like magic. Now, it is in theory possible to do flashcards without these 2 principles. So for example, you could do flashcards without spaced repetition, such as if you created a flashcard for the word for memory in Chinese and you just looked at it over and over, then that wouldn't be spaced repetition because you're doing it over and over and not just with some spacing in between. Or you could do flashcards without active recall, such as if you wrote all the information on one side of the card and you just flipped through them, just looking at the answers essentially and using that as a review method. Both these methods are uncommon and bad, so I will not discuss them here, but instead I will focus on the way I think most people use flashcards for learning Chinese characters and words. Before we go through some benefits of using flashcards that you might not have thought about, let's talk a little bit about what a flashcard is. So the most basic flashcard is what I've described before. You put something on the front, usually called the prompt, so that might be, say, a word in English, and you're then supposed to give the word in Chinese, maybe in speaking, maybe in writing. You then look at the prompt and you try to recall what it says on the other side of the card. So far so good, but with digital flashcards you can do a lot more than this. For example, there is nothing that limits you to having only 3 sides. Well, if you have a piece of paper, you can only have 2 sides, but if you do have a computer or an app, you can have as many sides as you want. You can also put different types of information on the front and the back. You can have audio, you can have video, you can have images, you can have combinations of these, and so on. There are literally no limits to what you can put on flashcards with some ingenuity. This also means that you can create flashcards where the prompt is very short. For example, it might just say memory in English and you're supposed to recall the word in Chinese, as I said before. Or it could be very long. Maybe it's a whole paragraph and there's just one word blanked out and that is the word you're supposed to recall. In a similar vein, you can have a very simple answer. So on the back of the flashcard, there might only be one word. And in our example then, this would be 记忆 if it's a spoken, or the characters for 记忆 if it was written. Nothing stops you from adding more things on the back though. You could have example sentences, notes, and many other things, and I will get back to some of these a bit later. Because digital flashcards are so flexible, there are many different ways of using them, and some of them might be very different from what you normally think of as flashcards. For example, people who only do long passages with close deletion and things like that. But I'm not too interested in this here. I want to discuss flashcards as most people use them. So why should you use flashcards for learning Chinese then? Well, as I've already said, learning with flashcards is very efficient, meaning that you can memorize a large number of words in relatively little time. This means that even if you only use small pockets of 5 to 10 minutes you might have available spread out through the day, using flashcards is a great way for expanding and maintaining your vocabulary. The second advantage is that it is extremely efficient for learning how to write characters by hand. It is in fact, I think, the only realistic option to learn to write by hand without spending thousands and thousands of hours. Of course, native speakers don't use flashcards when they learn Chinese in school, but they also spend way more time learning to read and write Chinese than most foreigners will ever be able to do. The third benefit is that flashcards give you immediate feedback about exactly what you didn't know. Naturally, you will also know what you do remember, but this is less useful, and the reason is that the things you don't remember, you probably need to treat differently in some way. You need to review them soon again, spend some extra time getting more familiar with them, or doing something to make sure you don't forget them again. Whereas if you do remember something, you just keep going. A basic tenet for flashcard design is to ask only for one piece of information. So if we have the word memory in English on the front of the card, we shouldn't ask for pronunciation and handwriting and then also be able to use it in a sentence, for example. We should ask for one of these things. If you want to remember more than one thing, let's say you want to be able to both write the word by hand in Chinese and also remember how it is pronounced, then you should create 2 flashcards. This is not hard to see why, because you can of course remember one and forget the other, and if you test for both at the same time, you don't know which you actually forgot, so you will need to review both. When I started using flashcards, this was actually the main benefit for me, because I realized that if I'm going to try to remember everything in my textbook and then everything in next textbook while also remembering everything in the previous textbook, that would be almost impossible to do manually, because how do you know which things you remember from chapter 7 in your previous textbook? Well, you could go to chapter 7 and just review all the words there and see which you remember and which you don't, and then spend more time on those that you don't. But if you're going to do this for every chapter in every textbook, this will take an extraordinary amount of time, and as your Chinese improves, most of the words you review here, you don't actually need to review, you know them. So hunting for those few words you don't remember and struggle with a little bit so you can spend more time with them is going to get harder and more time consuming. And this problem kind of disappears when you're using flashcards, because you will be very clear about what you do know and what you don't, so you can then spend time where it matters most. Benefit number 4 is that flashcards are very flexible and you always have them with you, provided that you're using digital flashcards, of course. If you're in the supermarket queue and you know you will have a few minutes, or if you're waiting for a friend who's running late, or maybe you're on the bus, you can just pull out your phone and do some reviewing. It's very easy to get started. You can spend as much or as little time as you want, including something like 2 minutes, and it's very difficult to do something meaningful in Chinese with 2 minutes available. If you pursue this strategy and spread your reviews out over the day, well, you get natural spacing from doing so, but you can also clear most of the vocabulary reviews you need to do in a day without impacting other things you're doing, including other things you need to do to learn Chinese. So I'm not saying that you should do flashcards instead of having a conversation with someone, but the types of situations where you can use flashcards are usually not the same as when you can have a conversation. So try to use flashcards when you can't do other things. Sometimes it will be necessary to do flashcards in other situations, but that is not the main goal. It's not meant to supplant reading or listening or other activities you should do. As I mentioned in the introduction, I will go through downsides of using flashcards for learning Chinese in the next episode in this series, and then in the final one I will try to balance the disadvantages and advantages and see where we can use flashcards, what we should use them for, how much, and so on. So that type of question I will discuss, but later. Back to the benefits of using flashcards, and this is benefit number 5. Measurable progress and increased motivation. Flashcards can make learning more visible. You feel that you are doing something useful. You can see the numbers of how many cards you have learned, how many you reviewed today, and how many characters you know. If you use flashcards for a long time, you do get very detailed information of what you do know and what you don't know in Chinese, and this can be rather useful. For example, you can use this type of lists to select reading materials or to find unknown words in texts and so on. It can be very motivating to see the number of characters and words that you have learned go up, even when you don't feel that your Chinese is improving that much. This is at least a sign that you are learning, even if you cannot feel it subjectively. As usual, I've written about most of the things I talk about here before from different angles, and I'll provide lots of links in the description, and you can also check the written article on Hacking Chinese. Moving on to the 6th and final benefit, and that is to collect notes about the vocabulary you learn. And this is, I think, a less well-known use of flashcards that I have relied on a lot throughout my years of learning the language. And it simply means that you take notes for your vocabulary learning on your flashcards, and presumably on the back here, it's not meant to interfere with the actual reviewing, it's just a convenient way to place information you think you might need later. This goes for anything you learn explicitly. Maybe you've looked up the difference between two words or how to use a tricky grammar word or character or particle or something. Then you can keep this on the flashcard so you can find it again later. And naturally, you could have a giant text document where you store this kind of information, but it gets a bit unwieldy, and saving it on the back of flashcards, I think, is much more convenient. So those were 6 benefits of using flashcards for learning Chinese. And I've used flashcards for most of the time I've been learning Chinese, not at the very beginning, as I said, and I don't use flashcard that much now, but I do use them for handwriting through Skritter. But back when I studied full-time, I used Anki a lot and built a deck of almost 30,000 words that I don't review that much these days because I don't really need to, but it was extremely helpful for building literacy in Chinese. I've used many apps besides Skritter and Anki, mainly Pleco, but this episode is not meant to be a comparison of different apps, although that's something I might return to later if there is interest. So if your goal is to pass the next dictation test or to do well on the vocabulary part of an exam, flashcards are, without a doubt, the most efficient way to do this. Or if your goal is to grow your basic understanding of common characters and words as quickly as possible, nothing beats flashcards. Learning Chinese is not only about dictation and exams, however, even if I know that some courses will make you feel like that. This means that even if flashcards are great for certain things, it doesn't mean that they are the best solution to every single challenge you will come across when you learn Chinese. And this is what we will talk about in the next episode. But before we leave the benefits of using flashcards for learning Chinese, let me just say that they work really well for some things, handwriting as I said, but also basic vocabulary information in general. It's possible to use flashcards to memorize a very large number of words quite quickly and efficiently, and also doing so without necessarily taking up lots of time from other activities you should be doing as well, such as listening and reading. If you've never tried flashcards, I think you should give it a try, especially for the areas that I just mentioned. If you have used flashcards but didn't like it, maybe you can try again, but limiting the use to the areas where it matters the most. But if you use flashcards and really didn't like it, I think you should weigh the pros and cons fairly carefully before deciding to use flashcards. I did talk about this in an earlier episode called Should You Use an Efficient Method for Learning Chinese Even If You Hate It? And it comes down to how much of a benefit you think flashcards bring and how much of a pain it is to use them. Check out episode 137 for a thorough discussion about that. So what do you think about flashcards, and what's your experience using them? Did you start early on as I did? Have you used them a lot or just a little bit for some specific purposes? Do you like them or do you find them boring? Do you think it's pointless or is it actually something that motivates you to learn more? Whatever your opinion is, you can head over to the written article on Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.